Shall we start? We have a small but very dedicated audience. So today I have the great privilege to introduce to you my academic father, Hiro Yoshikawa. My name is Clara Barata, and I work here for the administration of the university. And I also I have the pleasure to do some teaching at the Faculty of Psychology and Educational Sciences here at the University of Coimbra. And before we get to Hiro's talk, I would like to say a few words and try to briefly explain the impact that his research has had on mine. And I don't do that because I want to talk about myself. I do that because I'm hoping, because this is a teaching and learning opportunity for our students, that they'll also be inspired by his work to go further, to do more challenging things, and to learn in other ways that maybe we as a faculty can teach them. So I hope that works. In doing so, I will ignore maybe 90% of his work. So I'll talk about pieces of work that have been very influential, but there's a lot more that could be interesting for students to look at. So let's see if I can make this work. So that's me on the left-hand corner on my graduation day at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And I look happy and relaxed. And all of us who have a doctorate know that doctoral studies are neither very happy nor relaxed. They're a very challenging process. And in my case, what happened was that I had gone to this school to work with Kathy McCartney, an expert in high quality environments for early childhood and care, education and care. And she became dean of the school, kind of the role that Paula has in our faculty in the first year of my doctoral program, and she had no time for doctoral students. So the first year I was there, I had no advisor. And I was very lucky because Hiro came in that same year. And before he had sat down and linked his computer and gotten his first double espresso of the day, I was knocking on his door and asking why he hadn't replied to my emails saying that I wanted to be his doctoral student. So that's how bumpy things get. They are messy and complicated. And I know a lot of our students have struggled this year with getting advisors and feeling at home, but that's just part of the process. And it happened to me as well. And so when Hiro came, he brought this amazing studies that were being developed at NYU, looking at the question, how is culture? And when we talk about culture, we usually mean risk factors. We mean diverse language. We mean diverse ethnic profiles, but they were looking at positive features of culture, determining expectations and goals in parents, and in turn, determining child development. And so in collaboration with many other colleagues, such as Catherine Tamas-Lamonda, they did a birth cohort study of Mexican, Dominican, Chinese, and African-American children. And so as a prospective mother about to have a baby in the next few weeks or days, I don't know what I would do if some researcher came into my maternity room the day after the child is born and said, why don't you join us for 4 or 5 or 6 years in this amazing study? But here in this case, they matched research assistants very carefully with the families. They trained them very well. And so the recruitment really paid off. And so they had this subgroup of families. And then they followed babies and families for a very long time. And they used very diverse methods. And this is an aspect I would like to highlight. So they had structured, standardized measures for child development from birth, but they also had interviews, surveys, videotaped observations through home visits. And they did these really rich ethnographies with a subgroup of the families to get into this question, what is about culture that changes child development? What pieces of child development change? So I was blown away. Like I was really, really impressed. And I know this is what I wanted to do. And I did it in a much simpler fashion for my doctoral work and my postdoctoral work. So it took me, just as a note to our students, it took me all those doctoral years and postdoctoral years to learn the methods and to learn how to do these things correctly. It takes a long time. It's not just the courses you take in your first year that will get you to do this work. It's continuous investment. It still is. So that was what Hiro had brought to the Harvard Graduate School of Education. But then, Harvard, bigger things. I wouldn't say better things, but bigger things came up. And he started working on this question of how high quality preschools can change development. And this time with two other Catherines. There are a lot of good Catherines in your pathways, with Catherine Snow and Mary Catherine Arbor, other colleagues as well. And so to look at this issue of high quality environments in preschools, we were living in Massachusetts, and Hiro was coming and going to NYU, to New York. So it makes perfect sense that we ended up doing this work in Santiago de Chile, which was only 8,000 kilometers away. And that's a picture of our first visit in 2007, before the pilot started. And so the intervention was designed locally, which was very important. And it had all these important ingredients. It wasn't just looking at literacy or early math. It was teaching teachers, preschool teachers, how to manage behavior, how to promote executive functions, but also how to do health, how to manage health issues at school. So they managed well child visits. We did some stuff on nutrition, more later, but not earlier. And it had all these features because the child develops as a whole child, right? It doesn't develop in pieces. So we had all of these different rich components in the intervention. And then, again, using really rigorous methods, the team proposed to randomize school to treatment or intervention, not classrooms. Whole schools with multiple classrooms were randomized. So that was really something. And it gave the team the opportunity to say, these changes causally determine development. And without the randomized trial, we wouldn't have been able to do that. So again, I was completely blown away, and I promised myself I would do at least one randomized trial in my lifetime. And I was very lucky to do one here, the first one at the University of Coimbra, which was Playgroups for Inclusion, with Professor Antonio at the time receiving the team, os grupos Aprender a Brincar Crescer, and it was in 5 districts of Portugal. It was not in a place far away. It was not in a different language. No, there were no earthquakes, so it was much easier. We had earthquakes every week for Chile. But this was definitely a big learning experience, and Hiro's legacy was in it as well. And then a few years go by, and both Hiro and I moved back home. I came back to Portugal, and Hiro went back to New York. And he did a lot of other work, but this is kind of, I think you'll talk a little bit about this work. This is exceptional. Looking into how to use play to promote development, particularly father engagement. Now, I'm guessing most of us have done a little bit of work on father engagement. It's really hard to do, to get fathers in the picture and involved in the development of children. It's really hard to do. It's hard to do in our schools. It's hard to do in our parent networks as parents. And of course, Hiro and his colleagues decided that the adequate challenge would be to try to do it in refugee camps with families affected by the Rohingya, Syrian, and Venezuelan refugee crisis. And I can't imagine a more complicated, difficult scenario for development, right? These refugee camps are just really the toughest places, I think, to raise children. So they had really good partners, the Lego Foundation, the Sesame Workshop, the International Rescue Committee. They tested several interventions with randomized controlled trials as well, but also longitudinal studies that started before birth, because recruiting mothers at birth is not enough. You have to start before birth. So it's, and COVID hit in the middle of the study, right? So that's where it is. Now, at this stage, I gave up. I'm like, this is never going to be me. I'll leave this legacy for my daughters, my biological daughters, if they ever choose to do research in this area, if they become researchers, but also to my academic daughters who do excellent work, and they always take the hardest of challenges. But this is where the research can go if you really challenge yourself. So for students, I would highlight that as they listen to Hiro's talk, they think about these 4 criteria that make high quality research, and it's always present in Hiro's research. First, Hiro and his teams ask really challenging questions. They're not limited to their institutional functioning or how schools in their backyards or their regions work. We're talking about broader cultures, about culture, about poverty, about how developmental processes work. I didn't mention it, but here has done a lot of work on how money matters. We know, and we talk about poverty all the time, and it's always in our models. If you do quantitative research, it's in our recruitment strategies, if you do qualitative research. But what is it about money? Like, how much more money would families need to improve their children's development? If it did change development, what development would change? Is it cognitive? Is it achievement? Is it socio-emotional? So, and all countries put money into development, right? Every country has a welfare policy, gives parents money gives parents money so they do a better job. But is that money enough? Do we know what changes? So these are really broad questions that I think really push the science forward. And then he matches these really interesting questions with very rigorous methods. And I know our students are always afraid to take on complicated instruments or to find the right instruments, and then they design their own. It's really, you don't get the same data. You really have to find standardized measures, adapted measures. Even for interview protocols, there's so much research all over the world that we could use. And then something that Hiro does that I'm not good at, which is pushing the theory forward. So he matches the empirical data with theoretical work. And this recent paper is a good example of it, I think, because we know climate change is going to affect the development of kids, but how? And so here's a theoretical piece proposing some mechanisms of how climate crisis, climate emergency, climate change may change the future of our children. When we propose theory, we're more often wrong. So it's risky. And, you know, if Piaget hadn't proposed all those mechanisms for development, we wouldn't know he was wrong with a lot of them. But that's how we learn, and that's how science goes forward. So pushing theory forward is a really important mechanism. And then the final piece of high quality research is changing policy. This is what motivates me, and this is why I propose that Hiro talks about how research changes policy. It's not enough to do the research. You have to translate it, take it to policymakers, make it visible. Otherwise, it's really not enough. So that's from my side, my introduction. I'm going to try to put your work here now. I'm guessing this is it. It's not in the beginning. And I'll sit there so I can take notes, and I'll give the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Clara. That was very embarrassing. As intentional about work. I do want to say that Clara, among maybe 30 some doctoral advisees I've had over the years had, I think, one of the widest ranging interests in terms of methods. We have some new projects that we are in our kind of capacity building area around research, and we tend to, at our center, Global Ties for Children, that's focused on kind of child and youth development in low and middle income countries, think about the kinds of buckets of methods that are useful to do this kind of work that's at the intersection of research, practice, and policy. Um, and that, I think, was the slogan of the education school when we were there at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, was the intersection or the nexus of research, practice, and policy. So 3 sets of those methods, just as an example, are around measurement and psychometrics, around longitudinal methods of how human behavior changes, but also how contexts change over time. And then impact evaluation methods, including, not just causal methods, but qualitative methods. And so Clara really did all of those kinds of research during her doctoral years, which is very unusual, and had that hunger to master them and would challenge me always to be more rigorous, actually, because I remember you would question the psychometrics of our measures that we were using in Chile in very helpful ways. So I feel like this idea of mentorship is always a reciprocal process where you're learning just as much as the mentor, because frankly, we get old. We start, it becomes harder and harder to learn some of these new methods and keep up. But so I'm actually not going to present that much research, because I think Clara asked me to talk about when research changes policy. And so that's really inherently about a human process that's not often researched. But I'll talk a little bit about what my experiences have been in this area, which, first of all, start from the perspective that research rarely changes policy, right? So this is not something that happens routinely. It's not something that's easy. And among the kind of priorities of policymakers, research evidence is among the last things that they typically consider when making policy decisions. So I think that's a warning. But I do think it is really interesting to think about this intersection of these 2 very macro sets of influences of culture and policy that I've been interested in throughout my career, that Clara mentioned, or kind of part of what we were doing in our lab for a long time. And that is, I think, this new, it's still somewhat uncomfortable for developmental research and developmental scientists to understand that the macro influences are actually embedded in micro processes and vice versa. And so that is one of my kind of enduring interests. And the first time I gave this talk recently was at the 30th anniversary of an NGO called AÇEV in Turkey, which is the leading NGO around early childhood development, but was actually co-founded by 2 developmental psychologists and has moved into countrywide policy work after a period of 30 years of engaging and doing longitudinal evaluations, program innovations, and working with probably at least 20 different ministries and leadership regimes in the country of Turkey. So what was unusual about that NGO and that team was that the developmental psychologist who is the most famous, Chidem Kakibachi, was as much an expert in culture and human development as she was also in program development and evaluation. And so she did an extraordinary study in Turkey following how parents' views of the importance of children changed over 30 years in Turkey as Turkey industrialized and became globalized, and how children were viewed as kind of primarily economic in their value in the household at the beginning of those 30 years. By the end of those 30 years, children were emotionally valuable, more than economically valuable to households, as Turkey went through the transition of an industrialized nation, going from basically a low-income country status to a middle-income and now an upper middle-income country status. So what I took away from that set of work was that we want to understand how meaning making about children, perceptions of children change with historical time, understand that policy is based on values that have everything to do with culture, that then are instantiated in political processes. So I think these are not separate macro systems as we kind of use ecological language to describe influences on children. But these are inherently intertwining how culture and policy change over time. Now, as ideology of nationalist ideology, for example, is spreading in many countries, including my country of the United States, I am increasingly interested in the impact of ideology and how ideology impacts children's development as a macro influence, which is coherent systems of values that then get instantiated in institutions, in organizations, in schooling, and in child development. So my most recent study on policy and child development is in the state of Florida, which has enacted about 15 policies to restrict content related to gender identity, sexuality, and race in public education and higher education. So we're finding some fairly disturbing findings, but also the ability of educators and parents to resist some of these when there's a sweeping and very comprehensive set of policies. There is still organizing and there are still responses that I think are also really important for those of us interested in human development to address. So that's a little bit of introduction. I'm going to focus on early childhood development, which is probably the bulk of my work, even though I do work in youth development as well. Ask this question: how can researchers of child development really, which is a very kind of micro enterprise, participate more effectively in policy processes at national scale? And what might that mean for the practice of doing research in child development? So I'll start with actually the work of one foundation that has funded many studies over the last 15 years and created kind of a new area of research, which is research on the use of research evidence in policy. And so I'll briefly give some lessons from that. And then I think some examples where I think they reflect some of the ways that research suggests are the ways to work in the policy realm, but which are actually a little counterintuitive, and that some of the main ways that we think of to influence policy are challenged in some of this. So I'll give three examples. One from this work in the humanitarian sector around refugee families, one around the United States, and this idea of kind of creating can developmental scientists engage in actually creating and writing policy proposals that are ready to go as far as all the kind of policy choices, but also the budgeting and costing and finance issues. And then this notion, which I think is very important, of how can there be greater representation of low and middle income countries' scholars in the global developmental science realm, which I know everyone on this call, including the scholars from Brazil, hope will be interested in. I think it's been too much of a rich country dominated field of research, just like most fields of research, and how to think about that. So, okay, so what does research on the use of evidence in policy tell us? This is the William T. Grant Foundation is the leading social science foundation in the United States that's focused on youth development, which is humans between the ages of 8 and 25, actually 6 and 25. And Vivian Tseng, who was a vice president at the time about 15, 16 years ago, got very interested in this notion of why research isn't used very much in policy, and decided to start a set of funding that in an area that the foundation still funds in now around this area. Can we study the use of research evidence in policy? Can we study the policy-making process and understand what role evidence plays in it? And so there have been a whole series of reports that I can encourage folks to go on the William T. Grant Foundation website and find a series of summaries and syntheses of the perhaps 30 to 40 grants that they have funded in this area. But I'm going to give you just 2 slides of summarizing this. So first of all, what does not work? Actually, what does not work is what is typically done, right? Which is like in a typical article on child development that is applied and out in communities and doing great work. You will see a paragraph or 2 at the end that's part of the conclusion, which are, what are the implications for policy? And so where do those go? Well, they go into the research articles and they're of interest to researchers, but how does that ever make it into actual policy, right? So that's an obvious example. But also these things that I think we try to often do ourselves or do in our training, which is try to develop what we call the elevator speech version of your results. Can you convey the important results from your study to practitioners and policymakers? And that's mainly about simplifying language. There is also this, of course, a practice of writing shorter versions of complex studies and then conveying them and disseminating them to policy audiences and disseminating. And I'm not saying that these never work. These can sometimes work, but they will not generally work by themselves. Single event briefings. So I've been on many projects where we're like, well, let's go to Washington and do a day of a briefing, and let's invite the influential people working in this area, whether it's childcare policy or preschool policy or education policy, and let's brief them and present and get their reactions, even in that. But that's a single event, and so again, that by itself is not likely to create policy change. Even communicating to the public can be very powerful. Writing an op-ed, getting your work into kind of major national newspaper, writing blogs. This can fit all of these criteria of communicating science in simpler language, but that might not necessarily work. So how does policy get made? On one project where we were looking at governance and finance systems in early childhood development across 6 countries, one of the countries we studied was Peru, and I had the privilege of meeting a very unusual 3-time vice minister of finance of Peru, who happened to be very interested in early childhood development and had been one of the national advocates for this. He learned in his first time as vice minister of finance that all the important decisions happen in small groups. And so he left the ministry and he went to Argentina. And I don't quite remember why he went to Argentina to do this, but he became trained in group therapy because he understood that he wanted to learn more about social group interactions and small group interactions, which are the human context for policymaking. And then he returned to the ministry 2 more times, and he was instrumental in creating the transparency finance policy for Peru, which is how it communicates its budgets and, to the public. Policy occurs in these small groups, but in context of larger sociopolitical and ideological change. It can be influenced by social movements. What do social movements have to do with research? Yeah, researchers aren't actually on the front lines creating large-scale grassroots organizing, right? But it is involved in these kind of deeply relational interactions. And so the central lesson I take away from this, and really when I look back at about 30 years of the, infrequent instances when work with policy ended up being productive and it felt like research was being used, it was in the context of sustained relationships with small networks of individuals over a longer time than a typical ministry leadership regime. So if you stay in touch with a network of individuals who, in my experience, tend to kind of go in and out of government, might go across academia, government, civil society, and you stay in touch with them, and then you, over a period of years, and it can be 8, 10, 20 years, in the United States, it's been 50 years, I'll get to that, an unachieved agenda for early childhood, for example, but you have to stay in it. And you stay in it through networks and maintaining relationships with individuals. And that's really kind of the core of the message that this work that the William T. Grant Foundation funded, I think, tells us. And that these sustained partnerships are not about bringing your research and like hoping that they'll be interested in it. The sustained relationships are about actually answering policymakers' questions and meeting them where they are. I do have to say that this only works if policymakers are open to the role of evidence. If they're not open to the role of evidence, I've not found that those relationships are at all productive. So there has to be that kind of person. And when you have that kind of person, you know, in a ministry position or in a leadership position, you really want to treasure that relationship and you want to stay in touch with them as they move in and out of their policy role. And so that's certainly true with the positive relationships and examples then where it feels more reciprocal, right? So this is no longer a unidirectional, let's get research out into the policy world. This is a reciprocal, sustained dynamic relationships. And because it's sustained, you can then jump in when a policy window opens. And that's sometimes very, very rare. So it could be like in a period of 15 years that you only have 2 months where this evidence is actually going to be valuable. And then you are ready to do that only if you sustain those relationships and if someone happens to know the right people to, you know, it's all about networks. And so someone knows someone who is in a position to act during those 2 months. And then you can use all of those traditional methods. Then you can use the policy briefs, you can use the briefings, you can do all of that, but it's in the context of this set of relationships, right? And then I think we need to learn as researchers how legislation is written. We need to understand that the kind of track changes that they do are different than the track changes that we do on research articles, but it's actually exactly the same human function of editing something, right? So once you become familiar with that language, you have to, I think that's enormously helpful. And for me, also working with people who know about finance and budgeting in the policy world, which is not something I was trained in, but if we work with people like that, it's very useful. And I do also want to say that we have very low levels of engagement of influential policymakers, but also scholars from marginalized backgrounds. And that is really constraining policy in many, many places. I can talk about an example in Colombia that has a kind of permanent mechanism for indigenous people in that populations in that country to participate and contribute to the national ECD policy. So there are some examples around the world, but these are very, very rare. And it's much more often the capital imposing its views of, let's say, child development or what works for parenting or what works for preschool into the vast diversity of a country. So just as a short example of how partnering works, this very large humanitarian initiative called All Simpson was funded by the MacArthur Foundation as the first $100 million initiative on an important social issue of our time. It's a huge open competition, and Sesame Workshop, which is a children's media organization, and the International Rescue Committee, which is a humanitarian organization, won the competition in 2017, and we were privileged to be the research partners for these two organizations. But what I really respected about this project, and I think it was because of the pressure of having such a large grant and having to show some sustained impact beyond the grant period, that they took exactly this point of partnership and made it central to the initiative throughout its 6 years. And they addressed these issues of the fact that humanitarian systems involve three big potential policy and social systems: the host government, the refugee community, and the humanitarian sector. And they managed to reach a level of scale. We participated in the part, as Clara mentioned, which was to actually understand, do some of these program models actually work? And we found quite encouraging evidence on both the children's media and television program side and the on-the-ground services side and in the COVID remote programming side. But they reached a lot of scale primarily by having a full-time person in the regional office in Amman, Jordan, whose experience and their primary job was to partner with ministries. This is a project that occurred across 4 countries, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. And so this scaling, it was kind of envisioned as a scaling role, but primarily to build partnerships with at least three kinds of ministries related to early childhood development, which are, of course, health ministries, education ministries, and social welfare ministries. And ultimately, the other approach that was, I think, very smart was that Auckland Simpson, which means Welcome Sesame in Arabic, did not develop one early childhood development program, did not develop one curriculum. It developed a whole suite of materials that were developmentally appropriate, a whole set that were directed towards families, and a whole set that was directed towards more learning programs. And those were then flexibly adaptable to the needs of, let's say, the Ministry of Health in Jordan that had a midwife program for prenatal and postnatal care. How can we infuse these materials into the work of the midwives of the health ministry? The social welfare ministry of Lebanon having childcare centers of very low quality. How do we kind of adapt some of these materials into professional development materials for those childcare workers, right? So ultimately, 8 to 10 ministries really took up the materials, and so why some of this work is continuing is because they had that person who just woke up every day developing those partnerships and bringing the kind of this menu, this wide menu of kind of materials and models to ministries. And it turned out to be in a region that had a very high level of hunger for these materials because there weren't a lot of these materials in some contexts in the early childhood period. So this is a report that just came out 2 months ago that summarizes the insights from the scaling journey across 4 countries and with about 8 to 10 ministry examples, which I can recommend to their International Rescue Committee. But so they project that post this award, there would still be, about 1 million kids being served by ministry-run programs, not programs run by the International Rescue Committee, not programs run by the folks who got this grant, right? So in these just in case you don't want to read the report, the lessons from the report are that ministries take ownership. Again, right? It's not about the research, and in this case, it's not even about the implementing NGO. It's about the ministries taking ownership. They work with committees made up of agency staff at levels that are retained across minister transitions. I'm sure you're familiar with this in Portugal and Brazil, which is that if you work only with the leadership, they're gone in 18 months, or it's not really going to work. So you often work with the next 2 or 3 layers down of people who might stick around across transitions. And even those folks might be gone. So you do also need to work with the people who go in and out of government. The models and materials were developed to ensure alignment with national strategy and national standards. And these co-design processes can be actually initiated, again, with a need that comes from the industry rather than from the implementing organization or researchers. The third example is whether scholars can work in teams to actually propose national policy. And so the guru of this kind of work actually tends to work in team, but she directs these teams, but it is always team-based, and her name is Emily Vargas Barón. She runs an NGO called the RISE Institute in Washington, D.C. She's worked more than anybody in the world on the development of national early childhood development policies. She's worked in probably 40 to 45 countries, low and middle income countries primarily. And this is her most influential report that is really a guidebook. Like, what is the planning process? How do you think about stakeholders? How early do you involve stakeholders and what kinds of decisions? What is the range of decisions you need to kind of think about around health or nutrition or disability or early education? And what does the process of writing national legislation that could be proposed look like? And what does the political process and the following up, and then even if it gets passed, what does the implementation process look like at a national level? And so there are very, very few people who have that kind of expertise a multinational way, but her work is really reflective of that. And so she's certainly been one of my mentors as I've learned how it can be possible to support national processes without kind of having poisonous power relationships that are about imposing something that's never going to get implemented, right? And so it is a very participatory process she describes in this UNESCO report. And in the United States, I was fortunate and have been fortunate to be involved in a fairly long-term small team collaboration with some folks that Clara knows very well, with AJ Chaudhry, who's really the key person on this team, but with researchers in policy and in a few different areas, in parental leave, in childcare, and preschool, and in family support. And so AJ has brought us together, and we have been trying to influence US policy to almost successful points. And then I'll talk about how this process was applied to El Salvador. The title of this book, this is a book, so it's a national policy proposal written as a book. So it has all the kind of research backing detailed in it, but it's written in a fairly easy to understand style, and then it conveys all the policy decisions that would go into legislation in 4 different areas for the United States. And just as background, the United States does not have a national ECD policy, which might sound strange, but it has just a bunch of fragmented pieces. So its childcare policy is not connected to its preschool policy, which is not connected to its lack of a parental leave policy, which is not connected to its family support kinds of policies in the first years of life. And so we framed this as a way to reduce inequality, and that it was very important to reduce inequality in early childhood, partly because the level of inequality over the past 40 years in the United States, which was large for this percentile of 10 to 50% of income, which is the low income to middle class gap in achievement, for example, across all of schooling up to high school and college graduation and earnings, has now recently, because of the huge rise in the wealthy, the gap between the 50th percentile and the 90th percentile in the red that you see has grown. So it's just as large as that gap between the 10th and 50th percentile. So our argument is that we need to move towards more universal ECD policies, such as the ones that we might see in Scandinavia, and to attack these growing inequalities in the United States. And so these are our 4 policy areas: a paid parental leave, a guarantee of childcare assistance that goes way, way up into the middle class, universal early education, and a reimagined national family support program that covers the prenatal to age 5 entire period. I'm not going to actually, even though I have details here, I'm not going to go into these details because they're less important to me, I think, than the process for the purposes of this talk. Yes, so in each of these areas, we make certain decisions about what might be feasible at the national level. We bring in data that show these were new data that had not been kind of disseminated nationally, which is that there's unequal access to quality in childcare at age as early as at age 2 for lower income families. So we bring in certain kinds of very important research snapshots, but then we propose actual childcare policy. And I would say childcare is the most complex area because it is a public-private. Families contribute some, but the government contributes some. And so this is probably by far the most complicated area. We propose universal early education for 3- and 4-year-olds, which is a particular expertise area of Christina Weiland at the University of Michigan. Again, make a lot of these kinds of decisions that we know from the research evidence-based work to improve children's learning. And we integrate this notion of intensive family support. So we think these 4 areas together would take the United States from near last in the OECD in terms of investment in early childhood, it would bring it up to numbers actually 4 or 5. And it we well, why do we know that? We know that because we actually costed the proposal, and we wrote this book in time to be published for the Hillary Clinton administration. And so it came out, and we had galleys ready that November, and then of course we had no one to send it to. But it did get into the national policy conversation, largely because A.J. Chaudhry is one of those unusual academics that you want to stay in touch with. He's an academic, he's a public policy expert in early childhood. He ran childcare for Mayor Bloomberg in New York City because his dissertation of 44 families followed over 3.5 years that he did as a kind of anthropologist. By the end of it, he knew how to fix the childcare policy of the United States, because these families, that's all he needed, was to understand how they interacted with the inefficiencies of how childcare worked and trying to get sustainable childcare in New York City as a low-income family. He says that that's been the rest of his career, that his dissertation, now for the last 35 years, he's worked for the city, then for the Obama administration, actually working on Obama's preschool national policy, which was intended to be universal preschool for 3 and 4-year-olds that didn't get passed. But then he became a national expert, so has informed the primary national child care legislation of a group of senators led by Senator Patty Murray that has been then got integrated into the Build Back Better proposal, which was the last big social sector proposal of the Biden administration during those post-COVID times, and was about to get passed and then was nixed by one senator from West Virginia. So Build Back Better's childcare and preschool policies were actually based on cradle to kindergarten because AJ was in those networks. And so he was relied on outside of these kind of official processes, but in the work both at the level of Congress and at the federal process with the White House. But what the 4 of us did during the non-existent Hillary Clinton administration was to pivot to states, because in the United States, we have a federal system that's very decentralized. And so states do a lot of these proposals. And so we approached states that had action and progress in at least 1 or 2 of these areas that wanted to build more, and then did the same process, which is costing proposals. And AJ has this expertise, and we would work with research assistants to kind of, I guess it's not that hard. You have demographic information on, for example, the number of 2-year-olds. You have information from that state on what is the likely demand for childcare among parents of 2-year-olds. What is the size of the waiting list for childcare subsidies? How much are families willing to pay? How much do we think that childcare workers should be paid if their work was actually a living wage, sustainable employment? And what kind of quality supports should be provided and how much should they cost, right? So those are all the costing decisions that go into these proposals, and they're always 10-year proposals, because the idea to get to national scale is not going to happen in 2 years, it's not going to happen in 3 or 5 years. In a country that's really far behind, like the United States, it's going to take 10 years. So this process got done with Taryn and Chris and AJ really leading on the domestic work in a whole set of states, and policy was moved forward. And it's again because the request came from the states, or the need came from the states, but we were ready then with what's essentially legislation-ready language and costing and budgeting, because people are policymakers. It's the second question, or the first question they always ask is like, how much does it cost? I mean, they do often want to know whether something works, but I think an even more important question to them is how much policies cost. And then in a request from UNICEF El Salvador and a National Coalition on Children there, we applied the process to El Salvador. And there, a lot of the decisions were very El Salvador specific, but the process was exactly the same. Was what would be a national childcare policy in El Salvador? What would be a universal preschool policy for the country of El Salvador? And so what would family support look like? Building on the NGOs and the existing programs, which are really not at scale in that country. And here we worked with a very unusual person in the UNICEF office who was not like the usual UNICEF person. He was completely unafraid to be out in the political process. So he got a proposal that we developed with this coalition of researchers and advocates and civil society and former ministers, uh, developed this proposal, costed a 10-year proposal for El Salvador, and then brought it before all four presidential candidates in 2 elections ago. So the one that produced President Bukele, who is the current president of El Salvador. This was the only meeting that all four candidates actually ever attended together during the campaign, and they all publicly committed to a national ECD policy for El Salvador were they to get elected. So he built a very public event, which again, UNICEF typically doesn't do. They typically work behind the scenes with government, but not like out in the political process. And Bukele's wife happened to run a set of 20 preschools in San Salvador. She was very interested. So now the current policy does reside in the First Lady's office. But it has these notions of quality and supporting the workforce and upgrading not just access, but quality. Because I think she and her staff really got that message from this kind of work. And so AJ was involved in the costing. Jimmy Vasquez was the key architect of this in the UNICEF office. It led to, so in the global context, the World Bank is most often in low and middle income countries, this actor that is working on large scale investments in the social sector by doing these loans, right, to governments. And what happened was this was like kind of like writing a first draft for the World Bank and the IDB to use. And so they used it and they relied on Jimmy to provide that input, and this ultimately has financed about $600 million for the first several years of the national ECD policy in El Salvador, which is called Crecer Juntos, or Grow Together. I think there is an overlooked role for researchers to play, or at least researcher teams that involve the technical expertise of knowing what kinds of programs might be scalable, with the costing teams and the national partners, because it turns out the World Bank is very siloed. And so the technical experts are often not the ones working on country loans. And so that's a phenomenon that could be potentially bridged by having teams that have the technical experts working alongside costing experts. So you're kind of presenting a first draft that's pretty far along for the many countries now that are interested in investing in early childhood development, particularly early childhood education in low and middle income countries. I think I'm going to stop very soon, but I think this next example is about supporting research policy partnerships in low and middle income countries. And this was a project we did across about 5 years. And it's more about how to perhaps encourage this in contexts where it's not expected for scholars in academic contexts to do this kind of work. This was a project that came out of the Sustainable Development Goal process, and in particular a network that was led by Jeff Sachs, where I had contributed some of the input on early childhood development that went into the SDGs. But once the SDGs were passed, there was a big question of what to do. So this is a project to really try to support scholars in 2 regions, Sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, to conduct work that would advance progress towards SDG 4. Not with a lot of money, I would say, but with this notion of building in each country a set of research practice or research policy partnerships. And at the same time, try to build more of this representation of scholars from low and middle income countries themselves to be leading work and partnerships with policymakers and practitioners in these countries. So we provided 27 seed grants that were kind of 2-year seed grants, and we required grant applicants to apply in a team that was with an NGO partner or a ministry partner. they would have a mentor, usually from their country, and then they would have a mentee or an advisee who would be a graduate student. And these are all post-PhD level scholars working in education or human development or economics or policy in these two regions. And we had a senior advisory group, and in the entire application process, pre-award, post-award, the senior advisory group advised. And so beyond each grantee's personal mentor, there was a senior advisory group that reviewed the application. So we didn't review from NYU. These were the senior advisors who reviewed, and we had them representing several countries across the Middle East, from 9 East, West, and Southern African countries, from Francophone Africa and Anglophone Africa. Apologies, but Lusophone Africa was not included in this, so it was mainly Francophone and Anglophone. We ultimately funded 27 projects, and I'm going to present this presentation to a set of them, I think tomorrow, who are gathered in Lisbon for this international conference on child development. So I look forward to kind of getting their input on this. But they produced a variety of different kinds of research, but more importantly, they also disseminated these back to policymakers in their countries. So here, I thought with our work, when we work in low and middle income countries, I think it's been important for us to learn from the senior advisors within regions, from grantees, and not have this be a kind of rich country institution, kind of doing the advising or expert work. The skills we started with that Clara mentioned, longitudinal developmental science, the culture of human development, policy analysis and evaluation and implementation perspectives are still, I think, the core sets of methods skills that the senior advisors and our monthly Zoom calls were focused on. Mentorship can involve these flexible teams of 4 or more generations. And so those senior advisors who were working with the actual mentors, and then the grantees themselves, who were themselves mentors to the more junior scholars. But I have to say these were in very challenging institutional contexts where the institutions were not necessarily supportive of this kind of work. And the most productive researchers often get drawn into all kinds of other things. So what we didn't have in this project, which it would have benefited from, was engaging higher level university administrators in the research administration or the provost or the dean levels, which we did get advice from a former vice chancellor at the University of Zambia, who's also a cultural expert in human development, Robert Sirpel, but we didn't have the capacity to do that. And this notion of sustained partnership rather than translating or simply disseminating research. So finally, what are the conceptual skills and the actual skills that are required in this kind of work? I do think systems thinking is one area. And this was a recent initiative of the Early Childhood Development Action Network, which is the global civil society and advocacy and researcher network for early childhood development that came out of the SDGs. Developmental systems principles applied to how to transform educational and service systems. And so this has brought back a long-standing interest of mine in dynamic systems work and how it can be implemented. And so we've just some really wonderful colleagues, new colleagues. We put together a paper that was recently published in the Review of Research on Education about these kinds of principles. And so I think this notion of sensitivity to culture, to the policy process as a human interaction kind of process is important. I think for service systems, it's very important to have that very grounded frontline level understanding of how the micro interactions work. That's how our project in Chile started, and how this interest in kind of what are the adult-child interactions? What are the adult-adult interactions? What are the peer interactions like? You can't just jump to policy without knowing all of that and understanding implementation. The notion of sustained partnerships and listening to and answering policymakers' questions. I think it's really important to integrate causal and critical perspectives, which is a direction that my students have been pushing me in the past 4 or 5 years, especially, where I feel like I've learned a lot about how to think about kind of the RCT world, but from a more critical perspective. Learn these demographic and costing skills, or at least work with people who know them. To think about macro ideology, I think that's a new direction. I don't know yet whether that's going to pay off in terms of whether that will help in terms of influencing policy. Systems level outcomes I think, are a big challenge in the next phase of ECD policy, because we tend to focus just on those micro interactions and on child development. And then I think we have to re-engage in the SDG process as the planning starts for post-2030. That's a very technical issue, but I think it's important for the global ECD field. And then collaboration and input from diverse language, ethnic, indigenous, and migrant groups who are representing the diversity of our societies, but who get excluded from often these kinds of policy research dialogues. So that's it for the talk. And yeah, many people to thank in terms of some of these examples that I was relating. So yeah, happy to answer any questions in the room. I don't know how the YouTube works around questions, but if students want to text any or anything like that. Oh yeah, yeah. But
Chairman,
Okay.
it's easier for the microphone.
Yeah, we'd love to hear any reactions. Whether this, I don't know if it makes any sense from this standpoint of Portugal or Brazil, where I think this audience is coming from, but yeah.
I don't know if anyone wants to get us started. The American in the room wants to.
I'm just curious because we had mentioned Florida and your research in Florida in terms of public policy. I'm just curious because I know the background of the private sector and his cultural wars with Disney. I'm just curious as to your sort of impression of where the private sector comes in the policy debate. I mean, because Disney is a big proponent of, or let's say, opponent of DeSantis's directions. And you're doing a lot of governmental stuff, UNICEF, UN-based things. And we've got private sector folks on both sides of the ideology. Question. I'm just curious as to kind of your impressions or where private sector people like Disney come into the debate.
Yeah, I mean, I can say from just the not a lot of experience around that topic, but when I've seen effective national advocacy work, which is usually over a period of decades to get this marginalized area of early childhood into a national policy conversation, it has to involve business leaders and the private sector. And so typically, like a national coalition, Peru again, but two national coalitions, but the one in El Salvador too. I think the effective coalitions have people from civil society, often former government, not like current government. They might have a researcher or two. They have advocates, and then they do typically need folks from the business sector to be involved. I'm not sure that's always true. I think it probably is, but early childhood development is an investment that the argument goes will pay off for society, for the future workforce. So if you leave out the business sector, you're leaving out a major kind of potential beneficiary in the long run of early childhood development systems, right? So yeah, so that's what I've seen. Now you raise a U.S. context that's very currently polarized and with a about as polarized as it can get. So yeah, so our project right now is simply to be descriptive and to describe what's going on. We do think there are, pretty significant harms going on to students. This is not a quantitative study, it's a qualitative study. So it's a first peek into what this whole set of laws is doing in Florida. And that we are working to understand what are the needs of legal advocacy organizations that are actually filing all the lawsuits against the state of Florida right now. So that's where we are with that, is to try to, and that's very tricky to do, but it is, yeah, so that's kind of like not so much like, oh, can we influence the private sector on this side or the other? Here, I think the fight against those kinds of policies is illegal. It happens to be legal.
My question was, what extent question it's now
Yeah.
in putting aspects.
Yeah, and that I've seen more, in the global context, but I think also in some models, there's a model called Educare in the United States that requires investment by the business sector in a city to establish what's actually a very high cost single center, but the idea is that that becomes the hub for attracting attention to early childhood development in that city and will build the sector over time. It's a little bit of a risky proposition, but in every city, and it's now in 30 to 40 cities, this Educare model requires, I think, half the funding to come from the business sector of that city, from the private sector, and then the rest comes from government, state, and then federal, like Head Start. Yeah, and that's very intentional because they feel that for long run advocacy in the policy space, if business leaders aren't speaking up, then exactly what you're saying, it's not actually going to be sustainable. So it is part of that. It's just I haven't been directly involved that much in those. I mean, yeah, those kinds of conversations. George. Oh, no, sorry. Yes.
Want to become what's the best strategy, let's say, one of the best strategies concerning researchers at various levels in the university? What should they start learning? What strategy would be advised?
Yeah, I think the William T. Grant Foundation work would suggest that meetings to understand what the current immediate information needs of policymakers are, or what are their new policy initiatives that they would like to advance. And then in those conversations, I think, especially in your leadership position, you can let them know, oh, we actually do have work in those areas. But then I think the tricky thing is that how do you start building those relationships that are sustained over time, right? Because I think the scholars do need support. Yeah, this is the last question you emailed. I didn't have time to add these slides. Just like, what do we actually do, right, to support scholars? How do we train scholars to do this? Yeah, because I think all you need is one example of one person, and I'm sure there are in Portugal or many, yeah, who have engaged in this process, who can convey, okay, here are some lessons I learned in, like, don't bring in an international expert like me. Like they have to be local. They have to have experience of working with a policy in a policy area. So having that person help whoever, your faculty or a subgroup of faculty that might be best placed to do this, right? I think that's maybe one way to go, but it's a needs assessment like anything else in the sense that and usually identifying if there is a policymaker or two who are open to the role of evidence or science, right, in what they do. Now, of course, science policy, I know what George did recently was like really more around science policy itself, which is its own, that's like its own thing, right? Yeah, its own niche, and it's a little bit different when you're talking about content research. that is related to a research area that's not actual science policy. So, yeah, but I think it's trying to find out what those needs and questions might be, and then it's not every policymaker who's open to this. So it's actually sometimes it's a kind of fairly rare kind of person.
Reminds me of the strategic partnerships that Kathy had,
it's absolutely the same principle.
where they were asking schools and school clusters and governments, what question do you need answered? What would research bring that makes a difference? And they worked for years getting the question right before they did the research. And I remember at that time it was about academic vocabulary. So the difference between kids who make it and don't make it, poor kids and kids in families that take them to museums, and was this use of very sophisticated academic language, right? These kids, they use hypotheses while having dinner, or, they use these very strategic words, and that was what was making a difference over time in their achievement. But this question came from the schools, like, how can we embed more academic language? But it takes policymakers that can wait for an answer for a very long time. And in my work with policymaking, they want everything done like yesterday. And that's almost completely impossible with public institutions.
Yeah.
So George and I had to open a company to do this research work, because the ministry wanted answers.
Right.
So you have to really find the right policymaker and then do these pieces of work that they want done to gain their confidence. And then after you have that confidence, you build a long-term relationship that has more impact than just doing small reports on things that they want done.
Right. Yeah. No, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think there's two partnerships that are related to that I think have some of these characteristics. So one recently has been a partnership that I'm not involved on, but my colleagues at NYU are involved on, with the city around its universal pre-K program. And I do have to say that a lot of this kind of day-to-day work, so it has to be kind of distributed over a team, but there is a lot of kind of very minute and not certain how useful it is work, which is answering, once you develop a close relationship, the risk is that you just start getting these daily requests. So various parts of the city team would just constantly be emailing what were actually doctoral students on this team about, so one of mine was specializing around dual language learners and immigrant families and preschool. And so she developed a close relationship, but we had to manage it. I had to, as her academic advisor, manage it because it was starting to overwhelm her time, right? So that can be the downside of it. But on the larger scale, it was informing the entire monitoring system that the city was using to figure out whether these preschools had quality, what was the relationship between equity and quality, as the preschool program rolled out to 78,000 children in its first year. The other one, which is very positive, is our friend and colleague Christina Weiland's, I think, 18-year partnership now with the Boston Public Schools. And it is this one person, right? So it was based on this fact that there was this one person, Jason Sachs, who was very hungry for evidence, liked to use evidence in his ongoing monitoring of the program, though he otherwise acted like a regular policymaker, right? Like he would look at the research in a very positive way all the time and be like, yeah, well, that shows that's, but he was still always interested in improving the system. And now 18 years later, Chris and other professors at Harvard, Research Policy Institute, they still work with the Boston Public Schools pre-K program. And so that's, very long-term partnership. And it is sometimes finding that one person who is open to that. And it's very unusual that Jason stayed in that role for 16 years. He just recently left for the Gates Foundation, but that he stayed in that position, directing Boston's pre-K program, allowed that partnership to really develop across 4 or 5 phases of work, which is a pretty remarkable story. That also includes a lot of traditional academic publications and tenure and everything like that for Chris. So,
But what I've found, which is kind of the optimistic side, is that the government is willing to pay a lot of money. And so I always said we could do this fast-paced, uninteresting work that maybe involved reading 200 reports of 300, of schools and getting in a short report done that told the government if this was working, what were the proposals, and things like that, in a short amount of time if they paid my researchers really well. And so I always over budgeted for the fast-paced work, and they were willing to pay because nobody was doing this. So if we can find a mechanism in the university that's either kind of a center for research, for educational research or something that responds to the ministry needs, very fast work, and overcharges, because I was always overcharging them, then it gets done and we build this relationship over time and we gain trust. And then whenever they have some work that's more long-term, they ask us because they know we do a good job. So that was a surprise because you always think governments have no money, but the fact is they have to fill in all these gaps and things and monitoring reports, and researchers can help, and it helps build this relationship. I think to some degree, in comparison with the US context, we're lucky, right? We're educational policy, particularly for the early years, is continuously evolving in a positive way. We now have completely free daycare. And the coverage is going up every year. And it's really interesting. So immediately we saw that poor families and diverse families were more likely to apply for it. So we have much more diverse daycares now than we've ever had before. The downside for our family is that our daughter doesn't get a slot because we don't have risk factors. But that's, it's a good sign. Overall, It's a good sign.
That's what's called, so in the move towards the universal policies, this progressive universalism, it's called, which is that, that's why these 10-year plans are really important. But you typically, and that was the plan in El Salvador too, is start with the poorest municipalities and get to universal there, and then you start growing it out to the rest.
Yeah. So that I think we have an easier task on that side, but I think we have, with very few exceptions, policymakers that are not educated to use the research. It's much less likely that the research will be used in any policy decision. So I think what we also need to think is about, I would say, internships of our students in the ministry. Lots of governments do that. And I remember when we were at Harvard, the Singaporean colleagues had their master's program paid for by the government. But because of that, they had to work 3 years for the ministry when they returned home. And I received a grant from FCT. They just gave me the money and never asked for anything back. And I don't think we can afford that. A small country with a small GDP. I don't think we can afford to just give money away in applied sciences. I know fundamental sciences are completely different. In applied sciences like educational sciences, train our researchers outside in really competitive institutions, and then request nothing from them in terms of coming back and changing ministry policy. I think we lose an opportunity.
So Harvard at the Ed School it still has this program called the Strategic Data Fellows Program, right? Which is Tom Kane, who one of the leading economists of education, there started basically a capacity building training program for the people in essentially districts, which are like local ministries, who are in charge of the data that the ministry gathers, to be trained in research methods, to then be trained to bring the idea of useful questions that can be answered with data, and within the constraints of the data, how can those questions be answered, be trained in that process, learn what are often actually some of the basic research methods, but then no longer is their work just doing compliance reports of, okay, I need this report next week for our annual report of X, Y, and Z to this committee in the government, or something like that. the challenges they experienced in that program were that the just placing a fellow in, or just having one person be trained without kind of talking to their supervisor or the leadership, or how would they actually have a productive relationship where their opinion actually still gets heard, is still a challenge, and it still involves a small group, not just an individual.
Yeah, you still
Model.
need the policymaker that wants to listen to
Yeah,
data.
yeah.
But it would help to have somebody there and back, that goes back and forth from research to policy, which is this wonderful example of AJ Chaudhry. And of course, we can't clone him, or maybe eventually we clone him, but this process of going back and forth between research and policy seems to be the best way to acquire these skills. And there's these students in Portugal and elsewhere, they're just so sophisticated in their thought process that if we gave them the opportunity, they would get there. I met a lot of these at the OECD, like they're just phenomenal people from all over Europe. And they were doing policy and talking to policy designers there, and they were learning the language much faster.
Right.
Easy. But I mentioned policy. And one is one of your examples, there's something called by someone when you know that the operating
That's an understatement.
So first and partial two major parties are seen. Although I do see differences between them. Overall, but the question is, if you are going to policy, that's on the corner, and I'm not going to go. Or the other simple data where the four candidates would, I imagine these four candidates were not were diverse in the pool. But still, you know, at the cost of some complicated. Get the multiple people. What is it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think partly in El Salvador the timing was right in the sense that yeah, the point that the country has been in its economy and this growing awareness of early childhood development as being important is probably earlier than most rich countries still. And so the potential to get leaders from the right to the left all agreeing was higher than in some other contexts like the United States. So the United States has been there's a lot of evidence of how legislators have voted on issues over decades that we have a sense that certain presidents are much more likely to invest, right? And it is going to be the Democratic Party that is more kind of, it's a big government investment, right? And so, and the only reason it got as far as it did in the Biden administration was because COVID totally changed the magnitude of what was possible in US public policy to, you know, trillions of dollars of investment that made Obama's you know, kind of post 2008 stimulus look like the tiniest thing because COVID brought everybody into a kind of a panic and even Republicans were voting for these big investments in funding. Maybe we should turn off the video now.
The recording at least.
Yeah, I think I should be talking about different parties. But yeah, so I think the reason, and then Hillary Clinton was herself particularly powerful early childhood advocate over much of her career. And so there was a reason to like, to put ourselves into that corner at that particular moment, because we knew that in some sense there were some ways through networks to get to some of her policy thinkers and some of actually her lead transition type person on early childhood before you get, those people, we knew who they were. They were already identifiable, and it was possible to get like an early copy of the book out to, right? So that was some of the strategy, is like these kinds of networks. But I think you're absolutely right. In a lot of other contexts, is that you might be shutting out, if you're only focusing on one party, you are shutting the other party will perceive you as like just not being interested. And so I thought it was really interesting what Jimmy did in El Salvador, which was not just to go for Bukele was an obvious choice because his wife was running preschool centers, and so knew the sector. But yeah, and we did have some very critical conversations with the far left who were, so I was involved in one conversation, but it was like anything further, it was impossible for a US person to be involved because the far left would not accept anything from the United States, right? Yes, so that was an interesting context, and that's true in certain countries so that's been interesting, but that's neither here nor there if we're talking about a within country process, right? That like, what are the politics of US involvement in El Salvador, going back to the armed conflict that the US government implicated itself into and intervened in stuff. So yeah, so there are definitely global political issues, but I think you mean more kind of within country party diversity.
And
political diversity.
educational policies for early childhood in particular are not so clearly divided along ideological lines. I mean, the US, for instance,
Right.
West Virginia has had the most advanced policies on preschool because the argument is you want mothers to work, and it's an economic argument, and so they've invested for a long time in high quality policies. And if you exclude those people from the conversation, you'll lose the big section. Yeah, but those are more liberal type parties than just ideological. I think lots of the kind of more right, which in the US would look extreme left. So ours right wing parties are actually in favor of early childhood policies, and that's why we keep progress, because it's across the board. I think people want mothers to work, really, honestly, and produce. So if you exclude those from the conversation, it's harder. And the person I've worked with over years in the ministry, who's been working in foundations, and it has that profile. It goes back and then goes back into the ministry, is not a party person. It's a person who stays no matter what government is there. And that's kind of the person that's the most helpful, I feel. And to exclude certain people from the conversation would not be helpful. But it's an equilibrium between that and answering the questions and the requests from the government at the time of the post. The request is coming from the Socialist Party. You draw something for the Socialist Party, right? And that's what's happening maybe with the Hillary Clinton group, was that they wanted policy to be written on this interest, so you design it for them at the cost of eventually losing from good partners in government. But nobody expected what happened, so I guess.
No, nobody expected that. But before Build Back Better, the most generous policy around early childhood to be proposed and almost passed in 1971 by Richard Nixon, you wouldn't expect, right? So a Republican and a president that you wouldn't think of as, but yeah, that's how these.
And Mayor Bloomberg.
Yeah, also from a business perspective, right? So yeah, so it is.
Yeah. Listening to Jay Chaudhry and really pushing him to design policy that brought families into the childcare network.
The other question that I have is this one you said. What do you know? Anything that the answer to any that's probably would be something. Or should I just say, I mean, once anything, and so put you out there and you start building the network, or it could be not just for policy, it's also for many times we also comment on the US habits. Question is, that a good thing? Or is it? If I was able to make that comment against any single, is it possible? Should just was.
And never call you back.
Right, yeah. So, no, that's a great point. Yeah, well, so there's credibility that you want to maintain in the scientific community. And then there's like credibility, not credibility, but whether there's a sustained partnership in the policy realm. And my impulse would be to refer out. You know, if it's something a related area that you happen not to know about, but you might know somebody else, I would try to bring in somebody at that point. But I think it is important to acknowledge the limitations of your expertise. But one way to get beyond the limitations of your expertise is to partner with people who have that other, yeah. So, and for me, the it's like I'm not going to learn costing and budgeting of X, Y, or Z. So if there's any question about like how much is something going to cost, I'm like,
I thought we were going to train all our students to the costing and budgeting. It sounded like the answer.
grant proposal budgeting would be a start.
Well, I can help with that.
But yeah, but I think you don't want to give up your scientific credibility in engaging in the policy realm.
You do have to do some of those tasks, otherwise they'll never call you back. That's what happened with our company. Like what I did is I had a list of scholars, younger scholars, who were generally unemployed because work is so precarious in science in Portugal. And so I just asked them, who's interested in doing this? It's immediate work. It's well paid because I'll over budget for you. And it needs to be done now. It's part of our ongoing service to the ministry. Is this something? And then there would always be two people who would say yes. And we would do some of these tasks. And they were not in early childhood or impact analysis, things like that were interesting to me. And then, but you have to take responsibility for the quality of the work. So you have to read you have to read a lot of drafts of the report before it goes to the ministry. And you have to be on those meetings, even if you don't know the language. So it's a big challenge, but I found that there's actually, I guess, the upside for me is there's actually money to pay for this work. And it's technical and it's research work, and if you have the right partners, they can answer those questions. But if you don't do any of the work, if you just say, I'm an ECD, I'm a development expert for 0 to 3, I can't do anything else. They can't rely on people like that. So don't do that.
Yeah, absolutely. So,
we're running out of time, so last question.
For the great talk. I was curious about, what you talked about research and how to do much more than communication of results. Talking about scaling that up and having the capacity to build connection with the ministry of government, let it fly, let it be community partners. Here fear losing control on how your research results can be used by them or misconstructed by them, or do you have any control after that? Or it's something that's okay, done my job and let it go now. I was really amazed, how your research actually can have some impact, because we've all been involved in projects, we've all been overwhelmed with words. And once a project finishes, you start another one, and you kind of lose the capacity to maintain the previous one. Although it was very interesting, you're one person and you need to focus. And it was just good.
Yeah,
Your thoughts about it.
no, that's absolutely right. And I probably, haven't had enough of that direct experience, except to say that I think it's very important to become interested in how programs at scale are monitored, and how quality is considered, and that quality isn't just, for example, infrastructure or salary, as much as salary is important, but the actual quality of the program as it's experienced on the ground by diverse populations, right? And so I think that's, for me, that's the part of my work that speaks a little bit more to that process. And in Colombia, part of a partnership I didn't mention was one that led to the first national study of the monitoring of the observed quality of preschools, by going in and actually observing them. And then a few years later, it got written into legislation. Again, not by me, it's the partners working on the ground in the Universidad de los Andes and the Ministry of Education. So that kind of is there an ability to put quality on the agenda in a research-based way that would then be applicable to a whole variety of different models, right? Like whether they're doing, and so that's the kind of work that I think is also important for researchers to engage in. So it's not just a project, but developing the kinds of tools that might be able to be used by ministries. And from a psychometric standpoint, that might be reducing a quality measure that's too difficult, or it's very research-based. Okay, what does the factor analysis tell us are the core items that are predictive, that so it can be reduced for use by supervisors or use by a ministry, right? So there is actually some psychometric kinds of decisions around monitoring systems that I think are interesting and haven't been actually studied enough either. Thanks so much for the opportunity. Yeah.
Thank
Great.
you. So this